A reading from Paul's epistle to the Corinthians. If I speak in the tongues of mortals and of angels, but do not have love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give away all my possessions, and if I hand over my body so that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends, but as for prophecies, they will come to an end. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will come to an end. For we know only in part, and we prophesy only in part. But when the complete comes, the partial will come to an end. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became an adult, I put an end to childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part, then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known. And now faith, hope, and love abide, these three. And the greatest of these is love. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
It's an iconic moment in film for people of my generation. I'm talking about the end of the Coen brothers' cult classic, The Big Lebowski. Sam Elliott is a gravelly-voiced cowboy narrator who shows up in the bowling alley at the end of this movie to sum up this bizarre tale of mistaken identity. Jeff Bridges has played this self-absorbed narcissist who is strangely endearing for all of his trivial concerns, right? No matter what happens to him, no matter that he gets beaten to a pulp, nearly gets swindled by a corrupt billionaire, and loses a close friend, Lebowski's lazy, take life as it comes and don't sweat the small stuff or the big stuff either attitude prevails. So Sam's character addresses Lebowski, who is on a break from bowling. Take it easy, dude. I know that you will. Lebowski shrugs and says, yeah, well, the dude abides. And then he walks off with 2 beers in hand. The dude abides. Not exactly a script by the Apostle Paul. Paul has a very different take on the meaning of life. After 12 chapters of dealing with a church full of people at each other's throat, Paul lays down the law with his chapter on love. At the end of it, he says, faith, hope, and love abide, these three, and the greatest of these is love. So over the next 3 Sundays, we're going to take these 3 abiding things in turn, mixing up the order to fit our texts. And today, abiding love, because love abides. 1 Corinthians 13 is only slightly less familiar than John 3:16, even for people without a lot of Bible knowledge. It is the most commonly chosen text for weddings. How many of you had that one in yours? Right? Yeah. okay? And the long list of things Paul says love is and love is not is a good reminder to any couple that love is the secret of a successful marriage and of all human relationships. It is important to say, though, at the outset, that the love Paul is talking about here is not sentimental or romantic per se. I mean, sometimes people naively say that if only the church today could be like the church of the New Testament, everything would be fine. To which I normally say, really? Which one? Which church of the New Testament? Would you like Corinth, for instance? What a mess they were. As one commentator puts it, the Corinthian church has split into factions. People are pitting their favorite religious teachers against each other. Everyone's vying for power and prominence. Congregants are taking each other to court. The folks who speak in tongues believe they're superior to those who don't. People who shouldn't be sleeping with each other are hooking up shamelessly. Worshippers are fighting over everything from food to circumcision to celibacy to head coverings. The Eucharist has devolved into drunkenness and gluttony, and the poor in the church are going hungry. The Corinthian church is a church where all hell has broken loose. Far from honoring each other as fellow members of Christ's body, they are tearing each other apart. This is what inspires the love chapter. It's less a Hallmark card than a smackdown. These people need to learn to love one another, and Paul tells them what that love looks like. Now, love is easy when you're standing at the altar with stars in your eyes, saying your vows to someone your heart is telling you is the one and only for you forever and ever, right? But that's before your spouse has broken your heart out of neglect or having left you. And that's the real test of love, don't you know? How does love act then? Someone has said that love is like the cream filling between the chocolate layers of the Oreo cookie. It holds it together and gives it a sweetness. And I say, well and good, but I think it's more often like gritty cement than vanilla cream. Love is tender, yes, but it's also tough, right? Love is how we stay in the fire, says Valerie Kaur, a Sikh activist and lawyer. If you cringe when people say that love is the answer, I do too, she says. The problem is not with love, but with the way we talk about it. We mostly talk about love as a flood of emotion, but feelings alone are too fickle and fluid to sustain us when things get difficult. As a mother, Valerie compares it to the pain of childbirth. Love is a form of sweet labor, she says. Fierce, bloody, imperfect, and life-giving. A choice we make over and over again. If love is sweet labor, love can be taught, modeled, and practiced. This labor engages all our emotions. Sometimes love requires us to hold our anger and rage from making us strike out. Love bears all things. Love endures all things. It's about nurturing our hurt in a patient way that doesn't let the other person off easy, but pushes through the pain like a woman in labor trying to give birth to new life. If love were just our natural state, we wouldn't have to work so hard at it, right? So love intentionally moves toward others, not away from them. It requires us to see the other person who is scary or strange to us as parts of us we do not yet know. Love refuses to dismiss people as pure evil or irredeemable. And this is sometimes the hardest with those who are closest to us. Will Willimon tells the story about a man he knew who at the time was a young professor. And he was on a plane in the late 60s and found himself sitting next to none other than the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So he introduced himself to Dr. King, and as the journey progressed, he revealed to Dr. King that he too was active in the civil rights struggle on his campus. Because of his work in the racial struggle, he said he had become alienated from his father. He told Dr. King how his father could not understand him and how they had grown apart. "What can I do," he asked Dr. King, "to raise the consciousness of my father, to make my father see that he is a racist and that all his pious talk about loving black people is just a lie?" Dr. King put his hand on the man's hand and said, "Your father is doing the best he can. He has not had many of your opportunities which your father provided for you. As a Christian, you must be patient with him and love him." Love is patient. We are living in impatient times. Times that feel as if our divisions are permanent. Many worry our country is headed toward another civil war. We are so polarized, we are having a hard time finding the humanity in people we disagree with. Contrary to Paul's counsel, we are often found to be insisting on our own way. We are irritable, resentful. And where is that getting us? Whether from left, right, or center, there's little evidence of love. We must learn to turn toward one another instead of away from one another. And that requires more than simply internal work of attitude adjustment. It requires behavior modification. That means that we actually have to move beyond what we feel like we want to do what we must do. And that requires us to get out of our comfort zones and work to bring people together. Love, if you didn't notice the way Paul puts it, is a verb. It acts. When the British Muslim man entered Congregation Beth Israel in Colleyville a few weeks ago, taking hostages with a gun he purchased from a convicted felon, his hatred for Jews was apparent. But our friend, Imam Omar Suleiman, jumped in his car right away and drove to Colleyville in order to see if he could help negotiate the situation. He joined other rabbis there and Christian ministers too, including my admired Baptist colleague from Keller, Pastor Bob Roberts. They prayed together and tried to bring a peaceful end to the dispute. Happily, of course, the hostages were able to escape, but it didn't end peaceably. The standoff ended with the loss of the hostage taker's life. In the end, the sacrificial acts of many during that time resulted in a renewed sense that it just may be possible for Muslims, Jews, and Christians to live together in our culture if we were to practice the kind of love that believes all things and hopes all things. But you know, love isn't only about overcoming obvious evils like racism or hatred or greed or other discord. It also means living toward those things that are better than those things that are otherwise good. In this chapter, Paul is challenging the Corinthians to move beyond good things like knowledge, eloquence, and generosity to the highest good of love. I really believe the church is a laboratory for experiments in love, that if we succeed, allow us to commend an alternative way to the world. But for that to be the case, we must constantly examine the kinds of things in us that led to the divisions in the church at Corinth. Our church, for instance, is filled with smart, talented, and generous people who do things exceptionally well. And we are proud of that. But we need to protect against what Paul calls the spirit of boastfulness, arrogance, and rudeness. The moment we get to congratulating ourselves for all our excellence is when we are susceptible to falling into unloving patterns. I was telling some of you last Tuesday that as we look at this time of transition in our church's leadership, we can't get so fixed in our thinking about how we do everything right and others do things wrong. That there's a Wilshire way that must be preserved at all costs. That's not to say that we are open to undoing some of the hard-won gains over the years that have made us a church for everybody. But we only got to this point by continually asking what the Spirit might be leading us to next. And here's the thing. There is often more than one right way of doing things. But there is nothing that can be done that will succeed in the end without love. I tell couples as they prepare to spend their lives together that they will have to decide what's more important, being right or being married. And whether in marriage or in church or in the country, only love, the way of love, never fails. Love abides. Amen.